Here is a name that appears on the birth certificate of every British royal born since 1960. Mountbatten Windsor. You know the Windsor part. Everyone knows that story. But Mountbatten? Where did that come from? Why does a name that sounds vaguely nautical appear alongside the most famous royal surname in the world? The answer begins with a forbidden romance. A German prince who threw away everything for a woman he was not supposed to love. A family born in scandal that climbed its way into thrones across Europe. And a moment in 1917 when that family had to kill its own name to survive. So cut yourself a slice of Battenberg cake as we meet the family whose story shaped British royalty forever. It all began in 1851. Prince Alexander of Hesse and by Rhine chose love over dynasty. He married Julia Hoka, a woman whose blood was insufficient for royal standards. She was a countess, daughter of a Polish count, pretty, intelligent, utterly wrong for a prince. The marriage was morganatic, a legal term meaning Julia could never share her husband's rank. Their children would be forever marked as lesser. Alexander's brother, the Grand Duke of Hesse, eventually created Julia the Countess of Battenberg, then Princess of Battenberg. The name came from a small town in Hesse. The gesture was generous and damning at once. The Battenberg line was born not from royal splendor but from romantic compromise. Their very name announced what they were: royal enough to matter, not royal enough to inherit. The children of this forbidden match grew up in shadow. They were princes and princesses, yes, but of Battenberg, a title that carried the faint whiff of morganatic stain. Pure-blooded royals inherited thrones. Battenbergs had to earn their place, and earn it they did. The family married strategically across European royal houses. They wove themselves into continent-spanning dynasties with the determination of people who had something to prove. One daughter, Victoria, married back into the House of Hesse that had rejected them. Another son, Henry, married Princess Beatrice, youngest daughter of Queen Victoria herself. Battenberg blood entered the British royal line through a side door. But the most remarkable ascent belonged to the second son, Louis. He found his path through an institution that cared less about birth and more about performance: the British Royal Navy. Prince Louis Alexander of Battenberg was born in 1854 in Graz, Austria, a German prince with a morganatic stain and everything to prove. He joined the Royal Navy as a teenager. He naturalized as a British subject. He devoted himself to the sea. The Navy became his identity. Year by year, promotion by promotion, he rose through ranks not because of his royal connections, but despite the suspicion they invited. He served on ships around the world. He commanded vessels in active service. He demonstrated technical brilliance that even his critics could not dismiss. He married Victoria of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. He bound himself ever more tightly to the British crown. By the early 20th century, Prince Louis of Battenberg stood at the apex of the world's most powerful navy, a German-born prince who had become more British than most Britons dared to acknowledge. In 1912, he achieved the pinnacle: appointment as First Sea Lord, professional head of the Royal Navy. He was responsible for Britain's naval preparedness, its fleet dispositions, its war planning. In July 1914, just weeks before catastrophe struck, a British war plan for destroyer operations was drawn up by Prince Louis of Battenberg. The man born in Austria, bearing a German title, was planning the destruction of German naval power. The irony was exquisite. Louis had spent 40 years proving his loyalty through service. He had designed war plans against his homeland. His children had been raised as English aristocrats. None of it would matter when the fever came. On the 4th of August, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. For Prince Louis of Battenberg, this meant mobilizing the greatest navy on earth against the nation of his birth. He threw himself into the work with the intensity of a man who knew every decision would be scrutinized, every hesitation examined for evidence of divided loyalties. The British Grand Fleet was already assembled at Scapa Flow, held in readiness at the end of routine maneuvers. Louis had made that decision days earlier. He had ensured the fleet would not disperse before the crisis peaked, exactly the kind of strategic foresight that had elevated him to his position. It should have been proof of commitment. Instead, As weeks ground on and British casualties mounted, the Whisper campaign began. His name became a weapon against him. Battenberg. The word that had once seemed merely exotic now dripped with menace. Letters arrived at the Admiralty demanding to know why a German commanded British naval forces. Questions were raised in the House of Commons about the wisdom of entrusting national security to a man born in Austria. The fact that Louis had served Britain for over 4 decades meant nothing. The fact that he had naturalized as a British subject meant nothing. The fact that his war plans were even now being executed against German forces meant nothing. He was German. His name was German. In a war where German submarines were sinking British ships, that was enough. The breaking point came in October 1914, just 2 months into the war. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who had appointed Louis and admired his abilities, found himself unable to shield his first Sea Lord from the political storm. The pressure from press and Parliament had become unbearable. On October 29, 1914, Prince Louis of Battenberg resigned from the position he had spent his entire life earning. The official statement cited health reasons. Everyone knew the truth. He was forced to resign as First Sea Lord because of his German birth. A man who had devoted 40 years to Britain, who had planned Britain's naval war against Germany, who had proven his loyalty through decades of service, was driven from office because his name sounded wrong. The resignation was public humiliation. Louis retreated from public life. He watched as others commanded the ships he had prepared for war, executed the strategies he had developed. His health genuinely deteriorated. Stress compounded physical ailments, but the cruelest blow was still coming. The war dragged on. Anti-German sentiment intensified rather than faded. Widespread anti-German riots swept Britain, peaking following the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. Virtually every German-owned shop in Britain faced attack. Windows smashed, goods looted, people with German-sounding names beaten in the streets. Even the dogs were not safe. Dachshunds were stoned in the streets, kicked by strangers, attacked for the crime of looking German. The persecution was so thorough that in the years following the war, breeders had to import foreign stock to replenish the bloodline. The dachshunds had been nearly exterminated by patriotic violence. The madness was total. By 1917, the pressure to purge German associations from British life reached fever pitch. On June 13, 1917, German Gotha aircraft carried out a devastating raid on London. The first attack on London by a squadron of aircraft. 72 bombs fell within a 1-mile radius of Liverpool Street Station. 162 civilian deaths, 432 injuries, and the worst horror occurred at the Upper North Street School. A direct hit, 18 children killed, most of them aged 5 or 6 years, 37 more injured. The aircraft that killed those children bore the name Gotha, a German word, echoing in British newspapers, echoing the surname of the royal family, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Every newspaper headline screamed the word. Gotha raid kills 162. Gotha bombers strike London. The name of the royal house had become synonymous with dead children. King George V faced his own crisis of identity. He was questioning how German he sounded, how German he appeared. His surname came from his grandfather, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. German blood ran through his veins. His first cousins included Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II. Lord Stamfordham, the king's private secretary, acknowledged the problem. Germanic names and titles were in several branches of the royal family. No one was certain what the royal family surname was. The Battenbergs were not isolated. They were symptomatic of a larger truth the monarchy could no longer deny. In May 1917, discussions began in earnest. The king consulted with Stamfordham and with his cousin Prince Louis of Battenberg, the very man who had been driven from office by the same xenophobia, now threatening the throne. Louis understood what was coming better than anyone. The humiliation he had endured in 1914 was about to be institutionalized, legalized, made permanent through royal proclamation. The name Battenberg, The name his mother had been granted as compensation for morganatic status, the name representing both romantic origins and decades of service. It would cease to exist. Not merely for him, for everyone who bore it. On July 14th, 1917, 3 days before the King's proclamation, Prince Louis of Battenberg signed the document that ended his existence as a German prince. He relinquished the title Prince of Battenberg in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, along with the style of Serene Highness. The paperwork was administrative, bureaucratic. A man who had been born a prince, who had been called Serene Highness for 63 years, who had carried the Battenberg name as both burden and badge, that man ceased to exist on a summer afternoon in 1917. There was no ceremony, no witnesses beyond clerks, just ink on paper, signature on line, identity erased, Serene Highness. The words had followed him since birth. They announced his royal blood to every room he entered, every ship he commanded, every document that bore his name. Now they were gone. He was no longer entitled to be addressed as royalty. He was no longer a prince of anything. The title his grandfather had been born with, the style his father had carried, the designation that separated Battenbergs from commoners, stripped away because German aircraft had killed British children and British newspapers demanded German blood. 3 days later, on July 17, 1917, King George V issued the proclamation that completed the transformation. The royal house would henceforth be known as Windsor. All descendants of Queen Victoria, who were British subjects, would relinquish all German degrees, styles, dignities, titles, honors, and appellations. The Battenbergs fell under this sweeping edict. On that same day, Louis was created Marquess of Milford Haven, a British peerage to replace what had been taken, compensation for a wound that could not be healed. The name Battenberg became Mountbatten, an anglicized version preserving the sound while erasing the German spelling. Berg means mountain. Mountain became Mount. Battenberg became Mountbatten. The transformation was complete. The family born of forbidden romance in 1851 had been erased by xenophobic panic in 1917. No crowds gathered to mourn the death of the Battenbergs. No speeches marked the passing, just paperwork filed, titles registered, new stationery ordered, but mockery has a short shelf life. The fake English royals outlasted authentic German emperors. Windsor endured. Louis Mountbatten, Marquess of Milford Haven, lived to see the transformation bear fruit. The morganatic stain that had marked his father's generation began to fade. Britain survived. The monarchy survived. But the weight of what he had lost followed him. Here is where the story takes its final twist. Louis's younger son was also named Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten. He had been called Battenberg until he was 17. Then he was Mountbatten overnight. This younger Louis grew up to become Earl Mountbatten of Burma, last Viceroy of India, Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia during World War II, one of the most decorated and powerful figures in British military history. The morganatic stain that had marked his grandfather's generation, invisible by the time young Louis reached his prime. And his nephew was even more successful. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was the son of Louis's daughter Alice. He was born a Prince of Greece. He was a great-great-grandchild of Queen Victoria. He was also a Battenberg through his mother. When he married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, he renounced his Greek and Danish titles. He naturalized as a British subject. He took the surname Mountbatten. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, there was a fight about what the family name should be. The Queen eventually ruled that descendants who were not styled His or Her Royal Highness would bear the surname Mountbatten Windsor. The forbidden romance of 1851 had entered the direct British royal line. Alexander of Hesse had chosen love over dynasty. His great-great-grandson married the woman who would become the longest reigning monarch in British history. The morganatic family became the family of kings. Prince William is a Mountbatten Windsor. Prince George is a Mountbatten Windsor. The children of that scandalous marriage in 1851 now sit in direct line to the throne. The family that was told their blood was not good enough has merged with the family that rules Britain. The name invented in a panic. the family born in scandal, the dynasty that killed its own identity to survive. They are still here. They are still rising, from Battenberg to Mountbatten, from scandal to sovereignty, from a prince who chose love over status to a family name on the birth certificates of future kings. Alexander and Julia would be proud.